In the 5th year of dating George, someone asked him when he would marry me, and he hesitated. I heard a slight sigh in his voice. Whenever I think about Lily's past, I feel she's so filthy. I packed my things and walked away from him, but he begged me with affection, Lily, I was wrong before. Can we get back together? I looked into his pleading eyes and told him firmly, George, I've fallen for someone else. Recently, George has been acting strange around me. One night, I came out of the bathroom, and George pulled me into a hug. His kisses started passionately, but then turned rough. He bit my lips until they were bleeding, seemingly unaware. But just as things were naturally progressing to the next step, he suddenly stopped and turned away from me. I was confused, breathing heavily and looking over at him, softly saying his name. George, what's up? He pushed my hand away, facing his back to me, and muttered, I'm too tired today. Let's sleep. In the 5 years we've been together, George cared too much for me that I could sense even the slightest hint of resistance from him. Suppressing my emotions, I convinced myself he must be exhausted from work. Without saying more, I covered him with the blanket that had been kicked to the end of the bed and pulled a new one from the closet for myself. Maybe because I was watching him, I noticed his body tensed when I made up a new bed, but he didn't say a word. George's silence made me awkward, and I quietly offered, I move around in my sleep. This way, you can rest well tonight. He softly replied, I lay on the bed watching his back in a daze. This wasn't the first time. Maybe he hadn't even noticed. For the past month, he's been subtly resisting me. I wondered if we had been together too long, and if he was tired of me. But the love in George's eyes didn't seem fake. He still had feelings for me. It's just that there was a new emotion in his eyes I didn't understand, one that pierced my heart. With my mind full, I tossed and turned until dawn before I finally fell asleep. I didn't even know when George left in the morning. When I opened my eyes, it was already noon. Sounds were coming from the living room. I ran out and saw George carrying a small cake, heading towards the bedroom. As soon as he saw me, he smiled and quickened his pace. He waved the cake in front of me and kissed my forehead. There's been a lot going on at work lately. I might have been neglecting you. He sweet-talked me a bit, and all my discomfort disappeared, bringing me back to how things were before. George not only brought me a small cake, but also brought home lunch. There were 3 dishes and a soup packed up on the table. But when I saw the seafood porridge opened, the smile on my lips slowly faded. I'm allergic to seafood, and George has always known that. He wouldn't make such a basic mistake. I stirred the seafood porridge, looking up at him. Did you forget? I'm allergic to seafood, and the symptoms can be pretty serious. When George and I started dating, he saved up for a long time to take me out for a fancy dinner. I ended up having an allergic reaction to a bit of seafood and ended up in the hospital. Since then, George has kept my seafood allergy in mind. Hearing me, George seemed to wake up from a dream, hurriedly moving the porridge away from me. With an apologetic look, George explained, the meals were ordered by the new assistant. She's not familiar with my preferences yet. Eat the other dishes. I nodded, not saying much. I was really hungry and started eating the dish closest to me. But it wasn't long before a rash appeared on my neck, quickly spreading around. In no time, there were red marks all over my neck from scratching. I picked up the chopsticks to stir the dish and found seafood hidden underneath. Lily. George was more frantic than me. He snatched the chopsticks from my hand and rushed me to the underground garage before I knew it. He took me to the nearest hospital from home. George was distressed the whole way, apologizing while speeding up. I'm sorry, I should have checked the food before bringing it home. The allergic reaction was severe, and the itching and pain tortured me. It was hard to breathe. All these factors left me no room to comfort a self-reproaching George. Reaching the nearest hospital, George immediately carried my almost unconscious self into the hospital. Doctor, she's had an allergic reaction. What's going on? I heard Gary's voice. He's a doctor at this hospital and a friend from my childhood. He took me from George with quicker steps into the emergency room. When I got transferred to a regular ward from the emergency room, it was already 3 hours later. George stayed by my bedside without leaving. Gary quietly walked in, and after a pause, spoke with obvious frustration. You know Lily's seriously allergic to seafood. Is this how you take care of her? From the moment I met George, I knew he and Gary never got along. Coldly retorting, George replied, how I take care of Lily is none of your business. What right do you have to question me? Gary unbuttoned his sleeve cuffs and moved his wrists nonchalantly, saying, if you can't take care of her properly, I wouldn't mind. He didn't finish his sentence, walking forward and landing a punch on George's stomach. Almost instantly, they exchanged blows for several rounds, neither backing down. My pleas for them to stop were drowned out by their voices, until, in my anxious rush, I fell off the bed, Did they stop fighting? George picked me up and placed me back on the bed, then looked at Gary with annoyance. Gary gave me some advice and told me to rest well before leaving. After he left, George took me home from the hospital. Upon returning home, George didn't leave again. Having eaten a little to settle my stomach, I soon fell asleep from exhaustion again. When I opened my eyes next, the room seemed dark with the curtains drawn, making it hard to tell what time it was. I got up to the living room planning to get some water. Seeing light streaming from the study door that was slightly ajar, I knew George must be inside. Holding the cup of water, I approached, but before knocking, I heard voices from inside. You and Lily have been together for quite a while now. When do you plan to marry her? My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, and I listened intently to the conversation in the study. George and I met in our freshman year when my dad's business just went bankrupt, and he couldn't handle the loss and took his life. Once a pampered little princess, I became someone everyone looked down upon overnight. During that period, I was cornered in an alley by some thugs. They ripped my clothes, intending to harm me. Just when I was about to get ruined by that group, George showed up and saved me. From then on, he was around a lot, telling me it wasn't my fault, and I deserved the best love. I believed him, and over time, we fell in love. Now, it's been 5 years. In these 5 years, George has been nothing but good to me, but he's never brought up marriage. So, I'm curious about that too. After a while, I heard George sigh softly. I've been thinking, maybe not getting married is fine too. But when I think about marriage, I remember her past and it makes me feel she's dirty. She's dirty. Those words kept spinning in my head, and I couldn't focus on anything else they were saying. All this time, I thought George didn't mention marriage because he was focused on his career. Turns out, it's because he thinks I'm dirty. Even though it hurts, their conversation grabbed my attention. Apparently, what happened 5 years ago with those thugs had something to do with George. My sadness turned into intense hatred. I clenched my fist and recorded their conversation. Before they noticed, I went back to the bedroom. George didn't know I heard them and acted like usual. Even when he saw I wasn't in the best mood, he just thought I was unwell. He got me a few days off to rest at home. I tried to suppress my emotions and called Gary when George was away. Gary, could you help me look into what happened to those thugs 5 years ago? Gary's voice suddenly became serious. Why look into that now? The incident from 5 years ago left a big shadow on me. It was Gary who found me a therapist, so he knew how much I avoided talking about it. I pinched my palms and forced myself to calm down. It might have something to do with George. Wait for me, Gary said through gritted teeth before hanging up. Honestly, the moment I heard those words last night, George and I were over. A person who once tried to destroy me, no matter how much they pretend, to me, is just an enemy. He should pay for what he did then. Even if we split, I won't let him off easily. But before I heard back from Gary, a girl claiming to be George's assistant called me. Hi, I'm Tina, George's assistant. Are you George's girlfriend? Her voice was sweet like she was being all cutesy. Suddenly, I recalled she was the assistant who ordered that seafood set. Yes, what's up? She laughed before answering. George mentioned my mistake caused your allergy. I'm really sorry. George is taking me shopping this afternoon, and I want to get you a gift to apologize. Is there anything you want? Though her voice wasn't aggressive, her words were an obvious provocation. I turned down her offer for a gift. I went early to the time and place she mentioned. Since I was ready to face reality with George, how could I possibly ignore when evidence falls into my lap? Before long, I saw George walk in with a pretty girl. She was clearly Tina, the one who called me that morning. They entered a clothing store. I watched George hold up dresses against her. From a store away, I saw Tina trying on multiple outfits George picked. Their intimacy didn't look like a normal boss and subordinate relationship. I recorded it all on my phone. George's assistants had always been men. Tina was the first woman around him. George paid, then left with Tina at his side. Not long after, I saw Tina stumble, and George reached out to support her. Because of his gesture, Tina's drink spilled all over them. I'm sorry, I wasn't watching my step. There's a hotel nearby, let's clean up there. Since George's success skyrocketed his status, many women tried to get close to him. Compared to others who offered themselves, Tina's tricks were amateur. Maybe George just played along. Instead of rejecting her, he took her to the hotel. They got just one room. I followed them upstairs. The moment the elevator doors opened, I saw them enter a room. Shooting the room number with my phone, I held it at my side aimed at the door. Finished with that, I suddenly heard a dull thud, like something hit the door with force. Being close, I clearly heard their voices. My heart twisted, shattered again hearing their conversation. "George, what if your girlfriend finds out?" she said without a hint of shame or fear. "Don't mention her. It ruins the mood. Guess I'm not good enough if you're thinking of other things." His voice came with grunts, followed by banging against the door. Tina called George's name sporadically, and said nothing else. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. The noise inside paused, but didn't stop, because of my knocking. I don't know how long I knocked before someone finally opened the door a crack. George's sweaty arm appeared, with a fresh red bite mark. Seeing me at the door shocked him. "Who's there, George?" Tina peeked out from George's embrace. Because of her movement, the door didn't shut in time, and I saw her naked through the gap. No doubt what they were up to. George's face turned dark, and he slammed the door shut. After a while, the door opened again with George dressed, blocking my view inside. "Why are you here?" His face was filled with agitation and some panic. He was definitely mad at me showing up and interrupting him. But what bothered him more was me catching them in the act. Not covering for Tina, I shot back with a sarcastic grin. "Thank Tina. Called me this morning with your plans. Let me find you too easily." George glanced back. Tina had already vanished into the room. The veins on his forehead were bulging, and it was clear he realized he'd been played. He opened his mouth but said nothing. After all, he wasn't in the mood, nor was he going to let someone take advantage of him. I looked at him calmly. "You handle this. I'll wait for you at home." Then I turned and left, showing no hint of joy or sorrow. George's eyes stayed on me until I disappeared into the elevator. Just outside the hotel, I doubled over by a potted plant on the sidewalk, gagging. Thinking about the voices and everything I saw earlier made me sick to my stomach. George hasn't touched me in over a month, and considering his at the peak of his youth, cheating seemed almost predictable. But I never saw this coming. So much happening in just 2 days, all ending so ugly. George came back quickly, almost right behind me into the house. I drank a glass of water to quell the nausea stirring inside me, then sat across from him and looked at him. "We're not married yet. There's nothing we need to split. The house and car are yours. I'll take what's mine and leave soon." I said it all calmly. George ran a frustrated hand through his still wet hair, his voice muffled. "No, I don't agree. Lily, we've been together 5 years. Do we really have to end it like this? It was just an accident." My emotions were all over the place, my hands tingling a bit. It was hard to pinpoint what I was feeling. "The minute you went to a hotel with her, you should have known we'd end up here. I watched you the whole time. You had more than one chance to stop it." George couldn't look at me, his voice full of pain. "I honestly don't know why I did it today. I swear, it's the only time. I want to be with you forever. Once I handle this, we'll get married." I cut him off, mocking. "Marry? Is that your idea of making it up to me? If you really want to make it up, just promise me I'll never see you again. And being with someone as used as me, doesn't it disgust you?" George threw out a thoughtless promise, like so many times before. "Absolutely not." Staring into his unwavering gaze, I delivered the truth one word at a time. "Yes, you will. Your friends were over yesterday, and I heard everything. Not just now, but from 5 years ago. Need me to repeat it word for word?" At this, a flicker of panic crossed George's face, and finally, he shut up. I kept going. "Your antics are filthier than me almost being assaulted. The incident 5 years ago, blocked by thugs in an alley, had been his doing. It's laughable how I relied on him emotionally these past 5 years. We'd been together so long, he must have forgotten how my near destruction was his fault. He's the last person who should call me dirty. Back then, he was just a broke college student. Now, he's not the same George. Women throw themselves at him. Maybe for a while, he resisted, but eventually, he'd give in. Plenty of clean women were sent his way, and he began comparing me to them, seeing me as tainted. Listening to my words, he snapped at my assumptions through gritted teeth. "Lily, none of those things happened. You can't just assume." "But George, it's not an assumption, it's reality," I corrected. "Tina was his first slip, and cheating happens once, or countless times." George disagreed about breaking up, but it wasn't his call. Once I found out about the alley setup 5 years ago, I was ready to take him down, even if it meant destroying us both. George sat there defeated, watching me pack with pain and regret. I ran through all the people I knew in my head, and finally, called Gary. It was already 10 at night when I dialed him. Gary had just finished a surgery. When he got my call, he didn't even ask why and just came over. As I hung up, George suddenly ran over and grabbed my wrist hard. "Have you been waiting for this? Was it always Gary you wanted?" I tried to shake off his grip, my voice angry. "George, just because you're filthy doesn't mean everyone else is. It was you who ruined me, then acted like I'm dirty. You're the one cheating and blaming me for it. Have some decency." I rarely got angry, so I didn't know what provoking him would lead to. George tightened his grip and threw me onto the couch, smashing my back against the coffee table corner, making me cry out in pain. Ignoring it, he started tearing at my clothes. This ugly scene flashed me back to that night 5 years ago in the deserted alley. I struggled like mad to escape George, which only made him rougher. There were knocks at the door, followed by Gary's voice. "Lily, are you home?" I struggled to call out Gary's name. Suddenly, George yanked me off the couch, wrenching my arm so bad it felt like it would pop out. Half dragging me to the entryway, he pinned me against the door, biting me viciously. "Weren't you outside listening to me with another woman? Since you were so upset, let me return the favor." With George's words, thoughts of him and Tina made me gag uncontrollably. His brow furrowed. He let me go instinctively as I found the opportunity to open the door. As soon as the door opened, I collapsed to the ground, retching again. Not just from George and Tina, but at the thought he'd force himself on me. Gary took me away, though it wasn't exactly pleasant. When Gary entered, I was sitting on the floor, my clothes in disarray, tear-streaked, showing what had just happened. He dropped his calm demeanor and threw a punch at George without a word. They hammered at each other fiercely, but Gary's medical knowledge gave him the upper hand, subduing George. Gary went wild, pummeling him till he couldn't fight back, and I pulled Gary away. It ended in a farce. I didn't even want to stay and pack my things. I just left with Gary. I asked him to take me to the small apartment I bought. It's just 500 square feet, but it's plenty for me alone. I hadn't lived there in a while, so it was pretty much empty. Gary made a call, and soon people were delivering essentials. Watching him bustle around for me, I murmured an apology as he passed by. After starting with George, he was always insecure about my friendship with Gary, claiming his looks toward me held motives. I've been gradually distancing myself from Gary since then. Even when Gary got a job at a hospital less than 2 kilometers from where George and I lived, I didn't reach out to him. But now that something's gone wrong, he's still the only person I could think of. I grabbed a bottle from the liquor cabinet and poured us both a glass. "Want some?" Gary nodded, taking the drink and glass from my hand. Maybe it's true what they say, it's not the drink that gets you drunk, it's your own mind. I started feeling dizzy even before finishing a glass. That hazy feeling almost made me forget that Gary was still there. I curled up on the carpet with my knees to my chest, staring at the glass in front of me. Tears just started flowing. The 5 years with George replayed in my mind, and I started crying even more. I turned and saw Gary looking at me silently and managed to cry out, "Gary," he said, "I'm dirty." Turns out the thing that happened in that alley 5 years ago was done by him. He destroyed me once, and then again, after gaining my trust. I cried, my voice choked to the point where I wasn't sure if Gary could hear clearly. But when I saw his expression change from calm to furious, I knew he heard me. Gary pulled me into his arms with force. "I just found out last night that the guys who tried to assault me 5 years ago were George's doing." After George said I was dirty, his friend snapped back. "You set up all those thugs to trap her. Among all the ways to be the hero, you picked that, and now you're grossed out. Who's to blame?" I froze as I listened to their whole conversation. Apparently, even before his family went broke, George liked me. We'd never had any interactions then. He felt there was a huge gap between us. But he got his chance when his family went bankrupt and my dad passed away, leaving me all alone. Everyone wanted to take a shot at me. Many were eyeing me. George moved the fastest. He hired a bunch of thugs to trap me in the dark, staging a hero's rescue. He won but got seriously injured. I was so grateful he saved me. I saw him as my savior. But now I know all of it was his doing. He dragged me down to hell to meet me himself. Held in Gary's arms, I sobbed out everything, feeling his embrace tighten. Eventually, I didn't even realize when I fell asleep. After 2 days to calm down, I returned to work. Planning revenge on George wasn't going to be quick and easy. Maybe working would help me forget the bad stuff for a bit. What I didn't expect was to see Tina waiting outside after work. She was wearing that white dress George bought her, looking all innocent. As soon as I stepped out, she waved, smiling as she walked over. I frowned without saying anything. She acted as if we were best of friends. "Miss Lily, thanks for giving me George. I came to thank you." Her words were full of provocation. Maybe on a normal day it would have upset me. But knowing what George did to me 5 years ago, I only wanted them to be stuck together, toxic as they are. "Are you done?" "Then scram." She kept smiling, leaning in as she spoke. "Miss Lily, no wonder George never wanted to touch you. He told me he thinks you're dirty." That pushed me over the edge. My hand moved unconsciously and I slapped her. We were standing outside the dance studio. Teachers and students were coming and going. They all stopped and watched the scene unfold. Tina finally showed her true colors, feigning innocence while covering her face. "Miss Lily, Just because you like my boyfriend, doesn't mean you can hit me. She twisted the whole story, making it sound like it was my fault. People around us started whispering. I stared at Tina coldly. She wanted to ruin my job. No surprise she's with George, they're equally filthy. My hand itched, so I didn't hesitate to slap her other cheek, adding, "You're such a piece of work. Seducing someone else's fiancé, then coming to smear me. George and I are completely done. If you're hungry for a man, go after him. Provoking me gets you nowhere." Just then Gary squeezed through the crowd, standing protectively behind me. Everyone knows who the real homewrecker is, right Tina? If you don't want your little getaways with George all over the internet, you better back off. Tina glared at us, covering her face as she pushed through the crowd. As the crowd dispersed, the dance studio owner caught up with me before I left. He apologized repeatedly, saying it's best if I didn't continue teaching there. Too many students saw what happened, and I knew it would be bad to stay. People's words are powerful. I didn't resist and simply resigned. With work settled, Gary said he wanted to take me somewhere. I followed him to a little diner. Though 6 or 7 years had passed, this area had changed a lot due to development. Back when Gary and I were close, we used to come here often. But these recent years, I hadn't set foot on this land. Everything felt almost unfamiliar. Watching Gary lead us through the winding paths, I skeptically asked, "Is Aunt Kate really still running the place here?" "She is, we're almost there." Turning another corner, a familiar spot came into view. The diner's name and decor were simple, but business was much better now. Kate had a few new wrinkles. She lit up as soon as she saw Gary. "Gary, back for a meal?" "Yeah, I brought Lily to try your food. It's been years for her. I bet she missed it." Noticing me, Kate's face lit up with surprise as she welcomed us inside to a clean, quiet spot. The table was worn out, with doodles of 2 little figures etched on the corner. Everything felt so familiar yet strange. Kate busied herself back and forth, chatting away. "Haven't seen you in a while. It's Gary who's kept my business going. And thanks to him, I was able to keep this place." This place used to be our favorite spot, as Kate's cooking had that homey touch. But when I got with George, he didn't like me hanging out with Gary, and over time, I stopped coming. Learning that Gary still visited often made guilt rise in me. When Kate finally left us alone, I traced the old doodles with my finger, muttering softly, "Sorry, Gary, I've already told him this once before, but I really feel like saying it again now." He gently tapped my head with his chopsticks, sounding carefree. "There's no need for us to be so polite with each other. If our family hadn't gone bankrupt and Dad hadn't died, maybe Gary and I wouldn't be like this now." He always said I wasn't good at judging people, and I guess he was right. I was actually with someone like George for 5 years. On the way back, my phone kept buzzing. George was calling. I hung up, but it rang again. By the 3rd time, I was so annoyed I finally picked up. Just as I was about to ask him what his problem was, George started yelling at me. "Did you hit Tina? Is that why she's hurt?" "Yeah, so what?" George let out a sarcastic laugh, full of disdain. "Lily, when did you turn into such a shrew? Being with you is just embarrassing." I was wide-eyed and shocked. Did George just say that? Being with me was his embarrassment. I cut George off with a cold laugh. "You, of all people, have no right to say that. What about the things you've done? You should have been in jail back then." Bringing this up shut George right up. After a while, he spoke again. "You left so decisively. I thought you really didn't care. But Tina is mine now, and if you mess with her, you're messing with me. Lily, you ought to know that you have nothing now. You're not a match for me." Holding the phone tightly, my fingertips turned white from the pressure. In the next second, a calloused hand wrapped around mine, and Gary leaned in close. Somehow, the car had already stopped by the roadside. "Then add my family into the mix. Maybe you'll have a real match." I could hear glass shattering over the phone, so loud it hurt my ears. I moved the phone away a bit, and George's furious voice screamed out again. "Lily, you're with Gary." I just thought George was out of his mind. Who I was with now was none of his business. I didn't bother answering his question. "George, keep your woman in check. If she shows up to provoke me again, I promise she'll leave with bruises." With that, I hung up without waiting for George to reply. My good mood for the evening vanished. Gary pulled back and patted my head. "Why the long face? You should feel lucky to be rid of someone like that. It's something to celebrate." I gripped my phone tight, feeling my mood begin to lift. Yeah, the truth might hurt, but I should be relieved I'm not in the dark with George for a lifetime. After leaving the dance studio, I'm without a job now and taking my time to find something new. In my small apartment, besides myself, only Gary drops by. The next afternoon, when the door knocked, I rushed to open it without thinking much. In the next second, George pushed his way in through the crack. The smile I just started to wear disappeared instantly and my voice chilled. What do you want? Under 500 square feet. You could see everything in my apartment in one look. George didn't answer me. Instead, he looked around the entire place. Finally fed up, I blocked his way and pushed him hard. What are you trying to do? George seemed angrier than me. You're living with Gary. I found it funny and stared him down. What's that to do with you? Everything. You're mine. I shook off his hand, stepping back. George, you disgust me. We're way past done, and you should know that. So no matter what I do or who I choose to be with, it has nothing to do with him. But it was clear George didn't think that way. We've only been separated a few days, and you're already with Gary. Lily, you're such a slut. George's hand was gripping my arm so tight it hurt. I looked down. The spot he grabbed was already red. I yanked my arm, trying to break free, but his hold was too strong. The physical pain and frustration grew, but knowing I couldn't match George's strength, I stopped struggling. I let out a scoffing laugh. I might be a slut, but at least I'm not you, already rolling in the sheets with someone else while we were still together. I've kept all the proof of your cheating. Want me to give you some trouble? I still have the proof, whether it's about George's conversations with his friends or his cheating with Tina. I can't bring myself to just laugh off the harm he caused me, but I haven't found the right moment to make him pay yet. George didn't get angry, but instead, a glint appeared in his eyes. You do care about me, right? I messed up, sure, but how about we start over? If you say yes, I'll end things with Tina right away, and make sure she's out of our lives. A big question mark popped into my head. What in the world made George think I still cared about him? Seeing the pleading in his gaze, I shattered his hope word for word. George, you're dreaming. I've already found someone else. His expression turned fierce instantly. Who? Is it Gary? Yep, it's him. Can you leave now? George tightened his grip on my arm, questioning. And what about me? We were together 5 years. You can't just say you're over it. You must still love me. I found this laughable. You think I'd love someone who ruined my life? The 5 years I wasted with you are what I regret most. The light in George's eyes faded away, but he still wouldn't let go. Unwilling to accept what I said, he tried playing up our past. My gaze stayed steady, unmoved. Seeing no reaction from me, he became more vulnerable. Lily, what happened was really an accident. I was only sorry for Tina and gave her a job as an assistant. I didn't know she'd take it further. I slipped up and did something stupid. I called you yesterday, just to annoy you. I'll fire her when I get back. We'll never interact again. Can't you just forgive my one mistake, please? I really don't want to break up. Hearing him brush off responsibility, shifting blame like that, I couldn't help but laugh. You're wrong. Your biggest mistake was trying to destroy me 5 years ago. No matter what else happened, I'd never forgive you for that. I'm now at a point where I wish you were dead. George suddenly covered his face with his hand, and his voice started to tremble. Those people went too far. I just wanted to scare you. I never meant for things to go that far. It's those guys who didn't stick to the plan. And in the end, didn't I save you? I didn't let them really hurt you, right? Even at this point, he's just making excuses and shifting the blame. I don't want to talk to him anymore, so I start to kick him out. You should go. I never want to see you again. George wants to say something, but Gary walks in. Gary pulls my hand out of George's grasp and stands protectively in front of me. He smiles as he speaks. George, still hanging around here. Looks like you haven't checked your company updates yet. Almost right after Gary finishes, George's phone rings. George doesn't bother to check his phone, but he just clenches his fist, staring at mine and Gary's hands together. I suggest to George that he should answer it, or it might be too late. The phone rings again, as soon as it stops the first time. Now, he looks a bit unsettled. He answers without further fuss, but before leaving, he looks past Gary at me and says firmly, Lily, I'm not giving up on you that easily. After George leaves, I turn to Gary, grateful for his timely arrival. Gary, thank you. Then I ask what happened with George's company to make him leave in such a rush after one phone call. They are in the midst of going public, trying to work with a key investor. I worked the info you sent me. He lost a major partner. That info must be the evidence of George cheating. Without Gary, making George pay would not have been easy. He sits me down on the couch and brings me water. Maybe move to a new place for now, he suggests. I have a small apartment downtown. It'll be perfect for you. How about relocating there? I pause but end up not refusing. George's look when he left was chilling, and who knows what he'll do next. Gary brings news I've been eager to hear. Knowing George was behind that incident 5 years ago, I asked Gary to track down those punks. After they cornered me and got arrested, they were held for 15 days despite not physically harming me. That incident never sat well with me, so once they were caught, I didn't follow up. Naturally, I have no idea where they are now. But Gary found them and has people monitoring them, ready to step in if needed. That incident was reported to the police, so there should be records. Thinking back, my anger flares up. Gary, he needs to pay for this. I'm with you, he says. Because of George's recent crazy behavior, I haven't been sleeping well. A couple of days later, Gary suggests going to a yacht party. Only the big wigs of New York City get invited to this sort of event. Even when my family was still affluent, I couldn't attend such parties. I follow Gary around and notice George and Tina walking in together. They head towards a sophisticated-looking man right away. The sight of a polite George is not what I expected. That's William and his wife Emma. He's the investor George was hoping to work with, Gary explains quietly. I nod, indicating I understand. And Gary adds, William has a thing against infidelity. We aren't far. So I hear William's dismissive comment when George brings up the partnership. If someone's lacking in business acumen, I can offer guidance. But poor character. I refuse to engage with such people. The jab leaves surrounding people glancing over. George's face stiffens, and he awkwardly pulls Tina by his side. Don't misunderstand, he claims. Those rumors are false. Tina and I got together after I broke up with my ex. People speculate inaccurately about relationships, but William seems uninterested. Tina, clinging to George, brags, George, you're too concerned with impressing William. He knows your talent. Why would he believe gossip? I've heard William's daughter is around my age. Maybe we could hang out. I smirk privately at Tina's mistake. She's kissing up to the wrong person. Clearly William buys the rumors and her flattery backfires. He doesn't seem happy. Oh no, my daughter's too naive. Might get taken advantage of. William sneers, escorting his wife away. George and Tina are left standing, eyes prying around them. Gary's main gig is as a doctor, so he doesn't need business connections from this gathering. After introducing me to his brother, he takes me through the crowd towards the food. The desserts are by a renowned pastry chef, and are phenomenal. This is why Gary brought me, hoping the sweets will lift my spirits. Desserts charm aside, seeing George flounder for new partners, after William's rejection, makes me feel much better. Then I hear Tina laugh. Lily. I quickly mask my expression. I glance at her perfectly done makeup. You looking for another slap? Her mouth twitches. Then her hand rests on her belly. You might not know, but maybe I'm carrying George's child already. It's only been 2 weeks since their fling. Where's this kid coming from? Not my kid, so why should I care? I retort. She steps nearer, but I back off, smirking. Sorry, I might just slap you if you get any closer. Plenty of people are here. I'm not making a scene over her. She scoffs and stops acting all nice. George loves kids. What makes you think you can get him back if I'm really pregnant? I know George likes kids. He wanted one when we were together. Being unmarried, I didn't think it was right, so I was against it. If Tina's really pregnant, even if she tricked him, George won't leave her because of the baby. But, a jerk. If I'm not setting off fireworks after getting rid of him, why would I want to go back to him? If there's something wrong with your head, go get it checked at the hospital. Don't assume everyone else is as dumb as you. Tina pressed her lips tight, looking like she's using all her strength to hold back her anger. HMPH. I'd like to see what a woman who's been dumped can do. I looked at her coldly, having no interest in continuing this verbal spar. It's pretty sad when someone only sees their self-worth through a man. Tina stood there, stunned, as I brushed past her. I headed back to the banquet hall, and Gary and George were standing on each side. Looks like they heard my spat with Tina. I ignored George, who had an awkward look on his face, and walked away with Gary. Behind me, I heard George softly calling my name. I'm not sure how many deals were closed at that dinner, but seeing George and Tina on the losing side was very satisfying. The next day, I got more good news. 5 punks scattered around different places had already been taken to New York City by people George sent. Gary knows how much I hate George right now, and he updates me on developments as soon as they happen. Once those punks were brought back to New York, they were handed over to the police. I submitted the recorded evidence to the police and applied for a retrial. Normally, the chances of success in a retrial like this are slim, but I had the recordings as evidence. With a clear direction, the police found it much easier to interrogate. After a bit of questioning, those punks spilled everything. 5 years ago, when they were caught, they were only detained for 15 days, and because they were paid in small amounts of cash, it never led back to George. But now, with a clearer direction, the police found George had financial dealings with them 2 years ago. 2 years ago, that was exactly when George's career was kicking off, and his company was doing well. Those punks blackmailed George, threatening to reveal the truth from back then. George gave them a hefty sum to keep quiet, on the condition that they had to leave New York. Those punks had evidence of the transactions with George, and he was caught completely off guard. Things went smoother than expected. The day George was arrested, Gary accompanied me to the police station to await the outcome. Seeing me there, George looked at me with utter disbelief, shocked to his core. As I saw him, hands cuffed and behind bars, a deep sense of satisfaction washed over me. I didn't reply to him, just turned and left with Gary. Just as we were about to step out, I heard George's voice from behind, "Lily, I'm sorry."